Must have been a serious air traffic control problem for this little airplane to have flown into the first tower. Years ago, I was flying the 145, got based in Boston, and was looking for a job as a chief pilot because I had done some part-time stuff like that. And I called the guy that was turned out to be my boss back then, said, "Do you need help in New York?" Because they're getting ready to put the 145s into LaGuardia. And he said, "Well, I need help today," because we had a Saab base there. So I volunteered, go visit with the chief at the time, get hired to be an assistant chief pilot, is what they called it at the time there. And so I wound up being in New York, 2000, basically. November 2000 is when I got up there. And eventually become the chief pilot. But I do remember the 9/11, it's burned in my brain, obviously. I was at JFK that day. I remember riding on the Q10 bus, so I commuted up there, and I was staying Kew Gardens, which is halfway between LaGuardia and Kennedy. But I was mostly at Kennedy. I went to Kennedy pretty much Sunday through Wednesdays. So get on the Q10 bus, the public bus, takes about 35 minutes to get to the airport. Pick up school kids along the way, drop them off. And then by the time you get to the airport, it's just me and the employees, the airport workers. And I remember being in the back of the bus and looking at how clear the sky was that day. Probably the brightest, clearest day I've ever seen in New York in my life. And that was Tuesday, right? We'd get there in time. We had a morning phone call at 7:45 Dallas time, so at 8:45 New York time. And I had the radio on in my office, and that's when the announcement started coming across about airplanes flying into the Twin Towers. The first one had happened right around then, and I don't remember exactly the time, but I remember I was on the call, heard that on the radio, walked out, and we had CNN playing in the crew room. That's about the only channels we had in the crew room for pilots back then, was either the news or the weather, so you can see what's going on in the world, right? Walked out, and I remember the reporter was standing in front of the first building talking about must have been a serious air traffic control problem for this little airplane to have flown into the first tower. And in the meantime, the second one flies into the building right behind her. So obviously people thought the first one was a mistake, and once the second one happened, we all knew what was going on. Well, we didn't know what was going on. We had an idea that it was something not good. News started trickling out to us at the airport that which airliners were involved and things like that, so everybody was freaking out. And I learned about people that day, go to a lot of classes as you go through college and life, and you hear about people, how they react. And supposedly there's three groups. One group has no idea what to do. Just sit in the corner and look at the wall. The second group want to help, but they don't know what to do, and they run around like chickens with their head cut off. Then the third group, which I've found out to be is the very smallest group, are the ones that have an idea of what to do. So I went up to the checkpoint, and back then it was private security, it wasn't TSA or anything. Went up to the checkpoint and saw the cop. I said, "Are you guys closing the airport down? Are you securing the area?" And they just looked at me like I was crazy. "What do you mean? Why? With airplane hit a building, that's got nothing to do with airport." So I told all the pilots, hit the road, get out of there, get out of the airport. Then word came down that everybody get out of the airport. They evacuated all the people to the hangar, get the passengers out of there. It was a big threat, right? The world shut down. Being from New Orleans, I'd had a little bit of emergency experience with hurricanes and things like that. So I called the apartment and I told the folks at the crash pad, run to the store, get some canned goods, don't know what's going to happen. I assumed some kind of lockdown, curfew and things like that for the next certain amount of time, but didn't know much, right? So the rest of that day, telecommunications were out. Unbeknownst to me, later learned that half of all the communications in New York, phone lines and stuff, went through the bottom of the towers. So when the towers fell, it cut all the phone lines, well, half the phone lines for the city. And back then, we had gotten those little pages from SkyTel where you could text each other. And so that was the only communication I really had after about the first half hour. The first half hour, phone calls were still coming through. People asking where their loved ones were, who was on the airplane, things like that. Stuff we didn't have any answers to. But then once the buildings collapsed, the telecommunications shut off, and my little text thing worked, so that was hard to communicate with. Not many people had those things. So finish that day out, go to leave the airport, and it's just a ghost town, which I'd never seen JFK without people in it. It was a 24-hour operation. Go back to the apartment. The city appeared to be running mostly normal with the buses and things like that. People on the island, Manhattan, was shut down. They all had to walk home that night and stuff like that. So it was crazy. But every day we tried to go back to the airport. We would go back to the airport, me and the other chief pilots. We got to JFK, and the big roads that lead into JFK were blocked off by police and barricades, SWAT vehicles, things like that. And they weren't letting anybody in except for who could prove themselves. And we could prove we were the chief pilots, things like that. So they let us through. So we go out to the airport every day and listen to phone calls. And when are we going to start the country back up? Much less the airlines, right? Very few airlines were allowed to fly around. I know American got to fly a few flights, and United got to fly a few flights because of the crashes, to get accident people in place, stuff like that. But only other people flying around was the government, right? Go out to the airport every day, talk our way in, go listen to the conference calls, nothing happened. And then finally, we got word we're going to open up the airlines in the country. And I remember I got to fly out Saturday. Usually go home on Wednesday, but because of what happened, obviously I was there for a while. Saturday, I remember flying out of New York and seeing the dust from the air for the first time, flying out. Another clear day, which is crazy. And you could see the smoke rising from the holes. And that was almost a week later. And it continued when I went back to New York next week, it was still smoke in the air, right? Very traumatic for the airline, very traumatic for the world and the economies and employees. Changed our lives, and everybody would work for the airlines forever, right? Still can't forget that clear day on the back of the bus.